In these videos, what I want to do is talk a bit about one of the most well-known socio-political groups in Japanese history, the famous daimyo of the Sengoku, Tokugawa, and early Meiji periods. What we'll do here is trace, in broad strokes, how they came to be, because they emerged as a political and military force on the Japanese scene rather abruptly, and then came to stay. And by way of doing that, I also want to talk about the right of honorable death and the monopolization of legitimate and illegitimate forms of violence, the most well-known characteristics of the Japanese samurai warrior. So, the general background for the daimyo lies in the end of the Kamakura Bakufu and the rise of the Muromachi Bakufu, the first and second shogunates respectively, led by the Minamoto and the Ashikaga houses. Well, the Minamoto start out as leaders, but they very quickly become puppets of the Hojo family, essentially their in-laws. So, in 1324, a rebellion by the imperial court, attempting to wrest power back from the shogunate, failed. But 7 years later, in 1331, Emperor Go-Daigo launched another rebellion, which was successful for a number of years. This was the Kenmu Restoration, and it touched off a period of civil war which would see the destruction of the Kamakura Bakufu and the rise of the Muromachi. In doing this, Emperor Go-Daigo was joined, initially by, of course, many samurai, as well as by many Shugo and Jito, the immediate predecessors to the daimyo. So, who were these people? What's a Shugo and what's a Jito? When Minamoto no Yoritomo established the first Bakufu, the first shogunate, he doesn't do so to usurp, in any way, shape, or form, the power of the emperor or the imperial court. In many ways, the Bakufu, the military government, still required the court to operate because it was the court which granted legitimacy. Essentially, this arises as an attempt to establish some kind of government by and for the samurai, and it really solidifies a major theme in Japanese history: dual power structures. Yoritomo, officially, created this to help manage his own affairs and the affairs of his family, which honestly makes some sense as an excuse because the Minamoto land holdings, since they were technically a cadet branch of the imperial family, were massive and flung all across Japan. But, because this was a dual power structure and because his government worked with the imperial court, in 1185, Yoritomo declares himself the supreme Shugo and the supreme Jito of all the Japanese provinces, all 66 of them. Yoritomo then appoints other Shugo and other Jito to those 66 provinces. Now, you'll often see this presented in textbooks or works not specifically about Japanese history as something akin to medieval European feudalism. Now, Japan certainly was a society with vassalage in the European sense, but the Shugo and the Jito don't fit this paradigm of feudalism because they aren't being granted land in exchange for some sort of service. They're being appointed to government offices, and it's important that we make that distinction because it comes up every now and again. The Shugo were military governors, constables, essentially, who were given judicial and police powers over their provinces, which they helped govern in the name of the shogun, who was the supreme Shugo. Their job was to oversee courts, dish out justice, and apprehend criminals, and to keep a lid on rebellion or other local problems, and if the need arose, to bring the province's military, as well as their own local warriors and retainers to aid the shogun. The Jito handled the economic side of things. Essentially, they were land stewards. Prior to the rise of military governance in Japan, the imperial court had appointed governors to the 66 provinces called kokushi, and these kokushi began to lose their power during the Kamakura period when Yoritomo began to appoint Shugo and Jito to the provinces because they both did aspects of the kokushi's job. Like I said, this is a dual power structure. We can't say too much about the early Jito because we just don't know that much about them. There is one excellent book which really does a deep dive into the matter, and that is The Development of Kamakura Rule, written by a giant in the field named Geoffrey Mass. But they were authorized initially to oversee the economic health of the provinces and the large estates, the shogun, within them, and to collect tax revenue. Now, in 1221, a little bit before the period we started out with, Emperor Go-Toba attempted a rebellion, known as the Jokyu War, which failed, and the shogunate seized the land and the other property of the losers and gave them to the jito to oversee. But this caused a problem. The jito who took over initially were coming from the shogunal territories and the provinces where they enjoyed substantial power and rights over the land they oversaw. So when some of those jito are appointed to new offices and they begin to work with these new holdings, they're forced to deal with questions of power and rights. If a kokushi or some other figure had the right to hunt, for example, in a certain portion of the forest, or to fish in a certain part of a stream during a specific part of the year, or something like that, like anything really, well, was that a legal precedent for possibly expanding power? What could they do and what could they not do in these new territories? These were questions they didn't really have to deal with before the Jokyo War, and it's a major reason why one of the key types of document we have for the Kamakura period are court records. The Kamakura shogunate was one of the most litigious governments to have ever existed. So, with that said, I want to briefly return to this question of power structures and land tenure because it's going to play a major role in the emergence of the daimyo, and to do that, I find a passage from a book written by Mikiso Hane and Luis Perez, two major historians of Japan, from their book Pre-Modern Japan, A Historical Survey, really hammers this home. They say the following. Kamakura society did not bear the marks of a European-style medieval feudal system because the vassal was usually appointed to some office such as that of jito or shogun manager and was not given a piece of land to control as his own fief. With the office went the right to extract some income from the land, but the actual proprietary rights were retained by the bakufu or the shogun owner. Moreover, the political elements centering on Yoritomo still were not the dominant forces in the political and social systems. Although the real power was in the hands of the shogun, the administration operating out of Kyoto still controlled large parts of the country. Thus, we have something like a dual administration, with the bakufu, or shogunate, operating at least on the surface under the jurisdiction of the imperial government. During the Kamakura period, the earlier practice of submitting a nameplate at the ceremony of investiture was abolished and the vassal merely presented himself to his lord at the ceremony. As noted above, the benefits granted by the lord to the vassal usually came in the form of some office. In return, the vassal performed military duties in time of both war and peace and helped defray the cost of his lord's expenses. For example, he had to present gifts to the lord's household on such important occasions as births, coming-of-age ceremonies, and weddings. Although the tillers of the soil varied greatly in status, no peasants in Kamakura society could be characterized as serfs. The most well-off were the myoshu, who held title to and under the jurisdiction of the shogun proprietors. The myoshu in outlying regions tended to have larger holdings and often used semi-slave workers to till the soil. Although the practice was illegal, impoverished peasants were often driven to selling their wives and children to be used as slaves as household or farm workers. In addition, there were a variety of tenant farmers and hired workers. End quote. Okay, so that wasn't to really belabor a point, but just to make it clear that what we're dealing with is a societal structure that has multiple divisions of power, not all of which were based on land, because by the time we reach the end of our discussion, I haven't written the full thing yet, but I'm envisioning probably 4 episodes, we do reach a power structure based, at least to a degree, around land, and around the power dynamics of the daimyo and the samurai during the early Tokugawa period, which has sometimes been characterized as quote-unquote feudal. If you're going to use the term, it applies much more to the late 17th and the 18th centuries than it does to the 12th, but even then, not fully. Now, Minamoto no Yoritomo died in 1199, and he was succeeded as shogun by his son, Yorie, at the age of 17, and Yorie was formally appointed shogun in 1202. The next year, his maternal grandfather, Hojo Tokimasa, at the head of a general council, essentially took power away from Yorie, beginning what's called the hojo regency. And after he had Yorie assassinated, Yorie's younger brother Sanetomo became shogun. But because he was still a child, Hojo Tokimasa governed for him, which results in a governmental system where the imperial court was headed by a regent, the Fujiwara, and the shogunate, which governed alongside of and on behalf of the imperial court, was headed by a regent as well. So there were multiple systems of power here. Well, in 1205, Hojo Tokimasa tried to have Sanetomo killed, but the attempt was frustrated by his daughter Masako, the now widowed wife of the first shogun and mother to Sanetomo, and Hojo Tokimasa's son, Hojo Yoshitoki, and Tokimasa was instead exiled, and Hojo Yoshitoki became the regent for Sanetomo. But 14 years later, in 1219, Sanetomo was successfully assassinated, and the full power essentially transferred to the Hojo clan. Seeing an opportunity caused by the end of the Minamoto line, Emperor Go-Toba attempted to rebel in the Jokyo War, which we've already mentioned, and he failed in this attempt. Now, as we've already covered, the failure of Go-Toba's rebellion sees the shogunal Jito and Shugo move into other provinces, and sees the titles and administrative duties and the requisite estates in those areas, over 3,000. But it also does something else. It effectively solidifies the power of the Hojo regency within the shogunate, and it elevates the power of the shogunate over the imperial court. This was roughly the situation for the rest of the 1200s. The shogunate owned the majority of the land in the Kanto region of Japan, and its holdings in other provinces tended to comprise the majority of those areas as well, but there were regions where the shogunate held no land at all. Probably the most important aspect of all of this, or one of the most important aspects anyway, was the creation of the Joei Code in 1232 by the regent Hojo Yoshitoki. This was not a law code per se, but if you recall what I mentioned earlier, that this government was one of the most litigious ones to have ever existed, the point of the code was to establish a common set of instructions so that cases were handled fairly without taking into account where the litigants fell in Japanese society. Two things come out of this. Well, three things, actually. The first is that Kamakura law held that women actually had the right to inherit property, but because the household head had to be registered as a male, women were barred from actually doing so, but it would serve as a pretext for later reform. The second was the method of determining guilt. This was trial by judge, not necessarily jury, and the judge had to weigh the eyewitness testimonies and the documents carefully and come to an objective conclusion. This evidence wasn't always available, though, so when it wasn't, the litigants had to swear that their respective sides were correct, and then over the next week, if anything untoward or anything odd happened, like your house was struck by lightning, you had a nosebleed, a family member came down with sickness, or they died, anything like that, it was judged that that party was lying and therefore they must be wrong. Now, the third thing that happens, most importantly for our purposes in examining the rise of the daimyo, is that the laws and court cases were overwhelmingly concerned with property rights, taxes, inheritance, and governmental duties. This matters because the Joei Code sets a precedent for how laws and power structures would be established over the next 2 centuries, and it establishes a baseline from which the situation would ultimately change, and from which the daimyo would emerge. However, to fully understand that, we have to understand the rise of the Muromachi Bakufu and the collapse of the Kamakura Bakufu, and to get a grip on that, we're going to have to deal with the twin factors of a rising money economy, which sends shockwaves through the military establishment, and the threat of war, which saps the strength of the Kamakura Bakufu, and for that, we need to leave Japan, at least briefly, and travel to the mainland. Because it was on the mainland, on the frigid steppe to the north of China, that a man was beginning a process of unifying the nomadic tribes. During his youth, he was known as Temujin. We know him as Genghis Khan.